What looked like distance, what felt like indifference, was never as simple as it seemed. Because when you're dealing with an avoidant, emotional withdrawal is rarely about a lack of feeling. It's about an inability to process the intensity of what they feel. You have to understand something fundamental about avoidant psychology. They are not disconnected because they don't care. They are disconnected because caring creates pressure, and pressure exposes everything they've spent years trying to hide. When you showed up with emotional openness, consistency, and depth, it didn't just invite connection. It confronted them with a silent question they weren't prepared to answer. Can you meet me here? That realization doesn't create clarity for an avoidant. It creates shame. Not the kind of guilt that says, I made a mistake, but the heavier, more corrosive kind that says, there is something inadequate about me. And when someone operates from that internal belief, they don't move closer to repair the connection. They move away to protect themselves from being exposed. So what you experienced as distance wasn't a lack of value. It was a reaction to value. The more real the connection became, the more it highlighted the gap between what you were offering and what they felt capable of returning. And instead of rising to meet that standard, they retreated from it. This is where many people misinterpret the situation. They assume the silence means disinterest. They assume the emotional unavailability means they were easily replaced or unaffected. But avoidants don't process emotions in real time. They delay, suppress, and compartmentalize. In the moment, it may seem like they've shut off completely. But internally, something very different is happening. They are managing discomfort, not resolving it. Because to resolve it would require acknowledgement. It would require them to admit, both to themselves and to you, that they were present for something meaningful and failed to handle it with care. And that's not a small admission. That's an identity-level confrontation. It forces them to question how they show up in relationships, how they respond to vulnerability, and whether they've been protecting themselves at the cost of hurting others. Most avoidants are not equipped for that level of introspection in the moment. So instead, they default to what feels safer: distance, distraction, emotional shutdown. Not because it solves anything, but because it postpones the internal reckoning. And this is why their behavior can feel so contradictory. On one hand, there are moments of closeness, even intensity, glimpses of something genuine. On the other hand, there is sudden coldness, withdrawal, and a lack of follow-through. It feels inconsistent because it is inconsistent. You are witnessing someone oscillating between connection and self-protection, between desire and fear. But here's the part that often goes unspoken. The withdrawal itself carries awareness. At some level, they know what they're doing. They know they're pulling away. They know it doesn't align with what you gave them. And that awareness, even if it's not fully conscious, generates discomfort. That discomfort is the beginning of shame. And shame, unlike guilt, doesn't motivate repair. It motivates concealment. It tells them, don't go back. Don't explain. Don't reopen something you mishandled. Because going back would mean standing in front of someone who experienced their inconsistency firsthand. It would mean risking judgment, disappointment, or worse, clarity. So they stay away. Not because you didn't matter, but because you mattered enough to reveal something in them they didn't want to face. And if you look closely, this changes the entire narrative. It shifts the question from, why didn't they care, to something far more accurate. Why couldn't they handle caring? That's a very different problem. And more importantly, it's not one you could have solved for them. You cannot build emotional capacity in someone who avoids emotional responsibility. You cannot create safety for someone who interprets vulnerability as threat. And you cannot force self-awareness in someone who survives by staying one step ahead of it. So their distance as painful and confusing as it felt, was not a reflection of your insufficiency. It was a reflection of their limitation. And once you understand that, something shifts internally. You stop personalizing their withdrawal. You stop trying to decode every silence, every delay, every inconsistency, because you begin to see it for what it is, not a message about your worth, but a defense against their own. And that realization leads to a simple but powerful truth. Sometimes the person who walks away isn't the one who feels nothing. They're the one who feels something they don't know how to face. And if you follow that thread a little further, you begin to understand something even more unsettling. The story doesn't end when they leave. In many ways, that's where it actually begins for them. Because while you were left dealing with the visible absence, they were left alone with something far less comfortable: memory. Avoidants have a very particular relationship with their inner world. They are skilled at suppressing emotion in the moment, at creating distance, so they don't have to feel the full weight of what's happening. But suppression is not erasure. It doesn't delete experience. It delays it. And what gets delayed doesn't disappear. It accumulates. So what happens is this: long after the connection has ended, long after the conversations have stopped, they begin to revisit moments, not in a dramatic outward way, but quietly, almost involuntarily. A phrase you said, a look you gave them, a moment where you reached out and they didn't meet you there. These memories don't arrive all at once. They surface in fragments. And because avoidants are often more reflective in solitude than in connection, those fragments start to form a pattern. They begin to see not just isolated incidents, but a sequence, a series of choices where they pulled back, shut down, or withheld. And here's where it becomes psychologically significant. They don't just remember what happened. They remember what could have happened. That contrast between reality and possibility is where discomfort turns into something deeper. Because now it's not just about what they did, it's about what they didn't do. The conversations they avoided, the reassurance they never gave, the moments where they chose self-protection over presence. And unlike in the relationship, where they could deflect or rationalize, there's no one to negotiate with in these moments. No distraction strong enough to fully override it. Just a quiet awareness that something meaningful was mishandled. But even then, you won't necessarily see action. This is the part that confuses people the most. If they're thinking about it, if they're aware, why don't they reach out? Because awareness alone is not enough to produce change, especially when it's filtered through shame. Reaching out would mean translating that internal recognition into external accountability. It would mean saying, in some form, I see what I did, and I'm willing to face your response. And for someone who has built their entire emotional framework around avoidance, that is an enormous psychological leap. It's not just about sending a message. It's about stepping into vulnerability, unpredictability, and the possibility of rejection all at once. And more importantly, it's about confronting a version of themselves they've spent years trying not to. Oh, see. So instead, they stay in the internal loop. They replay moments, but they don't rewrite them. They feel the weight of their actions, but they don't express it. They may even come close, drafting a message, thinking about what they would say, imagining how the conversation might go. But then the same defense mechanism activates. Avoid. Because in their mind, silence still feels safer than exposure. And this creates a kind of psychological tension that doesn't resolve easily. On one side, there's the growing awareness of their impact. On the other, there's the ingrained habit of emotional retreat. And caught between those two forces, they remain stuck, not moving forward, but not fully moving on either. This is why avoidance can appear unaffected on the surface while carrying a very different internal experience. You might see distance, distraction, even apparent indifference. But internally, there can be a quiet repetition of moments they never addressed. Not as a form of growth, at least not immediately, but as a form of unresolved processing. And it's important to understand the distinction here. Just because someone thinks about you doesn't mean they're ready to show up differently. Reflection is not the same as transformation. Regret is not the same as repair. Those are separate steps. And for avoidance, the gap between them can be very wide. So while you may have been waiting for closure, for acknowledgement, for some form of recognition of what happened, they were navigating something much more internal and much less visible. A kind of silent confrontation with their own patterns, one that doesn't always lead to action. And that's the reality you have to come to terms with, because it means that the apology you deserved may exist, but only in their thoughts. The clarity you wanted may have arrived, but without your presence. And the understanding you hoped for may be something they reach alone, long after the connection is gone. Not because it didn't matter enough to address, but because addressing it requires a level of emotional courage they haven't developed. And once you see that clearly, you stop waiting for their realization to reach you. You stop expecting their internal process to produce an external response. Because you understand that for some people, reflection happens in isolation and accountability never follows. And the truth that stays with you is this. Some people don't lack awareness of what they've done. They lack the courage to face the person they've done it to. And when you begin to see that internal loop, the quiet revisiting of moments, the unspoken recognition, another layer reveals itself. Because awareness on its own does not guarantee accountability. In fact, for someone operating from deep-seated avoidance, awareness can actually intensify the very behavior that prevents accountability from happening. This is where the distinction between guilt and shame becomes essential. Guilt is specific. It's behavioral. It says, I did something wrong. And because it's tied to an action, it naturally points toward correction. It leaves room for repair, for apology, for change. Guilt, in its healthiest form, is uncomfortable but productive. It invites responsibility. But shame is different. Shame is not about what was done. It's about who they believe they are. It says, there is something wrong with me. And when someone internalizes that belief, the goal is no longer to repair the situation. It's to protect themselves from further exposure. For an avoidant, this distinction is not theoretical. It's lived. When they reflect on how they treated you, it doesn't stay contained at the level of behavior. It spreads. It becomes a statement about their capacity, their worth, their identity in relationships. And that shift changes everything. Because you can apologize for something you did. But it's much harder to step forward when you feel like the problem is you. So instead of moving toward accountability, they begin to manage perception, both yours and their own. They might minimize what happened, reframe it, tell themselves that the timing was wrong, that the connection was too intense, that you expected too much. Not necessarily because those things are true, but because they soften the weight of what they're avoiding. This isn't always conscious manipulation. More often, it's self-preservation, because to fully accept the impact of their behavior would require them to sit with a version of themselves they find deeply uncomfortable. Someone who withdrew instead of communicated. Someone who chose distance over honesty. Someone who caused harm not through intention, but through absence. And that's a difficult identity to hold. So they create distance from it, just as they created distance from you. They don't engage in the conversation that would clarify things. They don't ask the questions that would deepen understanding. They don't offer the apology that would open the door to resolution, because each of those actions requires something they've spent years avoiding: sustained emotional exposure. Accountability is not a single moment. It's a process It requires staying present long enough to hear someone else's experience, to tolerate discomfort without shutting down, to resist the instinct to retreat when things become emotionally complex. And for someone wired to escape that complexity, even the idea of accountability can feel overwhelming. So what you often see instead is a kind of passive avoidance, not dramatic exits or overt rejection, but subtle disengagement, delayed responses, vague explanations, conversations that never quite reach the depth they need to. It's not that they're unaware, it's that they're unwilling or unable to remain present long enough to address what they already sense. And over time, this pattern reinforces itself. The more they avoid accountability, the more unresolved experiences they carry. The more unresolved experiences they carry, the more shame accumulates. And the more shame accumulates, the harder it becomes to step forward, because now they're not just avoiding one moment, but a pattern. This is why, from the outside, their behavior can seem almost paradoxical. You might think, if they know they hurt me, why wouldn't they just say something? But that question assumes a framework they're not operating within. It assumes that awareness leads to action, that discomfort leads to resolution. For avoidance, discomfort often leads to withdrawal. And this is the part that requires a shift in your understanding. Because if you continue to interpret their lack of accountability as a reflection of your importance, you will stay stuck in a loop of questioning. You'll look for signs, for explanations, for some indication that they recognize what happened. But recognition without responsibility changes nothing. You can be fully seen in someone's mind and still not be acknowledged in their actions. You can be understood internally and still be avoided externally. And that gap between what they know and what they do is where most of the confusion lives. But it's also where clarity begins, if you're willing to see it. Because once you accept that their inability to take accountability is rooted in their relationship with themselves, not in your worth, you stop expecting a level of emotional presence they haven't developed. You stop negotiating with silence. You stop interpreting avoidance as ambiguity. You see it for what it is, a limit, not a temporary hesitation, not a misunderstanding waiting to be resolved, but a structural boundary in how they relate to discomfort, responsibility, and emotional truth. And that realization doesn't just explain their behavior. It frees you from trying to change it. Because the truth is, accountability cannot be extracted. It has to be chosen. And if someone is more committed to protecting their self-image than confronting their impact, no amount of patience, clarity, or understanding from you will alter that. So you're left with a decision of your own, not about them, but about what you're willing to accept in place of accountability. And the answer, if you're honest with yourself, becomes very clear. You cannot build closure with someone who refuses to stand inside the truth of what they've done. And when you put all of this together, the distance rooted in shame, the silent replaying of memories, the avoidance of accountability, you arrive at a final, uncomfortable truth. It's not just that they struggle with connection. It's that they struggle with being seen after the connection has revealed who they really are. Because at some point, whether they admit it or not, they recognize something about you that makes returning far more difficult than leaving. You saw them clearly, not just the version they presented at the beginning, composed, independent, in control, but the inconsistencies underneath, the hesitation, the emotional withdrawal, the moments where their actions didn't match their words. And more importantly, you responded to all of that with awareness. You didn't ignore it. You didn't normalize it. You noticed. That level of clarity creates a kind of psychological mirror that avoidants find deeply unsettling. Because now, coming back isn't just about reconnecting. It's about re-entering a space where their patterns have already been exposed. It's about facing someone who doesn't just feel something for them, but understands them, and not in a way that allows them to hide. And for someone who has built their identity around maintaining emotional distance, that kind of visibility feels like risk. So the fear shifts. It's no longer just the fear of intimacy or even the fear of vulnerability in the abstract. It becomes something much more specific. The fear of being fully recognized after they've fallen short. Because if they return, they can't pretend it didn't happen. They can't reset the dynamic to something lighter or more surface level without it feeling disingenuous. The history is there. The awareness is there. And so is the unspoken understanding that something meaningful was mishandled. And that creates pressure, not the kind of pressure that comes from expectation alone, but the kind that comes from contrast between who they were perceived to be and how they actually showed up, between the potential they allowed you to see and the reality they retreated into. That contrast is difficult to stand in. So instead of facing it, they avoid the entire situation, not because they've forgotten you or because the connection lost its significance, but because returning would require a level of emotional coherence they don't yet have. It would require them to align their actions with their awareness, to move in a way that is consistent, accountable, and open. And that's exactly what they've been avoiding. There's also another layer to this that often goes unnoticed. When someone knows they've hurt you, not in a vague way, but in a way that was visible, felt, and unaddressed, they begin to anticipate your response. Not necessarily what you would say, but what you could say. Your clarity becomes a variable they can't control. You might ask questions they don't have answers to. You might express emotions they don't know how to hold space for. You might reflect back an experience that forces them to confront